I spent countless years pouring my energy and dedication into rescuing our struggling family enterprise, only for them to turn on me in a way that I never thought possible, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of hurt and anger. The irony now, watching it collapse on itself, is that it offers a strange kind of triumphant satisfaction, a feeling that the collapse itself is the most astonishing payback I could have imagined. I had become so invested in the family firm that it virtually consumed my life. It felt as though I was sacrificing a promising career in the tech world, one that had already begun to blossom, just so I could see our family's business pull through one of its darkest chapters. And how did my loved ones repay that devotion? By selecting my brother as the solitary inheritor. The sting of betrayal pierced me like a blade, and it was undeniably the most insulting thing anyone had ever done to me, especially because I had dedicated so many years to make everything flourish. In that moment, I chose to step away and establish my own path. Little did I know that the turn of events awaiting my brother and the business would end up being the most unforgettable comeuppance I could have asked for. I want to offer you all the necessary backstory to grasp the depth of this situation. My great-grandfather had originally established a modest importing venture, carefully nurturing it so that it could be passed down through multiple generations. Both my father and grandfather invested immeasurable amounts of sweat, tears, and heartfelt dedication into its growth, and for a long time, everything seemed to be going remarkably well. But when I was only 24, catastrophe struck. My dad was involved in a catastrophic accident that left him with severe trauma to his brain. He was paralyzed for almost 2 long years, which meant my brother and I were forced to shoulder the burden and figure out how to keep the business afloat. Unfortunately, my brother had no desire to carry this load and basically backed out without hesitation. I could not allow myself to do the same. I couldn't abandon something so precious to my father and, by extension, to my entire family's history. My great-grandfather had died when I was around 9 or 10, but I felt a deep need to preserve what he had created, because I knew he would be devastated if the company was cast aside. Back then, I was just getting started in tech and had landed a highly promising position. Yet, I decided to give it all up, and to this day, I don't lament that decision. I devoted the prime of my life to that company, laboring relentlessly to ensure its advancement and profitability. We didn't morph into some colossal corporation, but we were undoubtedly experiencing the highest profits in decades, all thanks to my unwavering efforts. All of my dedication and meticulous work, however, went straight down the drain when my brother, who had not contributed even a single day of meaningful labor, suddenly inherited the business. It was a complete and utter bombshell that none of us had expected. My father passed away last month, and that's when we discovered in his will that practically the entire company would be transferred to my brother's name. Sure, I was still going to remain the CEO with a decent salary, but my brother would officially be the owner. Essentially, it meant all the major decisions for the company were his to make. I felt blindsided by this revelation, devastated on a level that words can barely convey. My passion, my commitment, my blood, sweat, and tears, none of it seemed to matter. I approached my mother, hoping she could explain or provide some logic behind my dad's choice. She told me that Dad had disclosed his plan to her before he died. That was yet another massive shock to my system. She went on to explain that the rationale was rooted in wanting my brother to finally learn a sense of responsibility and that having me guide him would be beneficial for his personal growth. My mother tried to appease me by saying I'd still receive the same amount of income, as if it was just about finances. She didn't seem to realize that for me it wasn't about money at all. It was about how my time, energy, and pride had been completely disregarded. I was worth more than being a glorified caretaker of my brother, especially when all the authority, and eventual recognition, fell into his lap. After wrestling with my emotions, I resolved to resign. I had a reasonable amount of savings and felt confident in my reputation, as well as my wealth of experience, that I could find another decent position elsewhere. Even if I had to take some time figuring out my next move, I knew I had options. Therefore, I left before my brother could step into his new role. Let me describe my brother so you can really understand what made this even more galling. From childhood, he was consistently lazy, reckless, and notorious for spending money on trivial things without a second thought. He led a lifestyle of pure indulgence, never stopping to think about how to actually earn that kind of luxury for himself. To put it bluntly, he believed our family's resources were limitless, that money was simply there for him to blow. I already mentioned that he refused to pitch in when Dad's health took a terrible turn and left him incapacitated. Yet, a part of me still held onto a hope, small but persistent, that he would finally get his act together now that the entire business rested on his shoulders. I even tried offering some advice out of lingering goodwill, but he quickly dismissed my suggestions and insisted he had everything under control. He genuinely seemed irritated at me for leaving, using harsh words to tell me he could handle it all by himself without my interference. It was painfully obvious soon enough that he was in way over his head. He quickly started carelessly squandering the company's resources, hiring his buddies, most of whom were utterly unqualified, and throwing extravagant, showy parties that served nothing but his ego. Meanwhile, our long-standing customers grew unhappy and began to take their business elsewhere. Only a few months after becoming owner, my brother decided the company needed to branch out into manufacturing. Now, that was indeed my father's dream, but the reason I held off on making that dream a reality was because I was aware of how complex and risky it was. My brother, evidently, believed he had the necessary competence to pull it off. But that turned out to be an absolute fiasco. In under 6 months after I departed, the entire operation was on the verge of collapse. The products they tried to produce were so substandard that distributors refused to partner with them. The business was hemorrhaging funds at a staggering rate, and my brother was at a complete loss as to how to right the ship. I heard about all this through word of mouth, as it became common knowledge, but then employees who had stayed behind started contacting me. They pleaded for me to come back, stressing how the place was falling apart and that, if I didn't intervene, it might be lost forever. I admit, I was momentarily tempted to lend a hand. But then I remembered his earlier callous treatment and how he had single-handedly wrecked the sturdy foundation I had painstakingly built. It dawned on me that he needed to face the consequences of his own actions. So, I deliberately chose to remain a spectator rather than jumping in to rescue him. And honestly, it felt like karmic retribution at its finest. The peak moment of vengeance, if you can call it that, arrived when my brother finally reached out to me. Desperate and nervous, he admitted the business was sinking rapidly and implored me to return and rescue it, and him, from the ruins. I calmly asked if he would relinquish his leadership role and officially transfer ownership to me if I agreed to come back, but he refused. Instead, he tried to lure me with a raise, emphasizing it was all about the money in his eyes. But it had never been about the salary. It had always been about respect, recognition, and fairness. So I turned him down. With that, the company spiraled even further into a financial black hole, edging closer and closer to bankruptcy. My brother was powerless to stop the implosion, and all those so-called friends, the ones he had thrown lavish parties for, promptly vanished. He was left alone to survey the ruins of what had once been a proud family business. He had to fire countless employees, and more resigned on their own. The whole enterprise rapidly turned into a lost cause. I admit I felt a stab of schadenfreude, recalling how miserable he had made my life during my tenure there. Now, at last, the tables had turned. But I also grieved for the loyal employees who were innocent casualties in all of this. And it broke my heart that a company, which had been a part of my family's narrative for so long, had been destroyed and reduced to rubble. Still, I had no remorse about quitting. I made the choice that was right for me. Update 1. I am taken aback by the tremendous reaction I've received. Thank you all for your encouraging comments and supportive words. It's been genuinely helpful reading your thoughts and discovering that many people have faced similarly harrowing family betrayals. Right now, I'm giving myself some space to regroup and map out my next steps. I do have my sights set on starting my own company someday, but in the meantime, I'm aiming to utilize my skills and background to secure a new job, one that could lay a stronger foundation for me. I'm thrilled to see where this path leads, and I promise to keep everyone posted as things develop. Although I feel confident about my prospects, you can never completely predict how the market or economy might shift, so I appreciate all the good wishes you can send my way. Update 2. A few months have zipped by since I last checked in, and I'm glad to share that I've found a new job. It's not as spectacular as I'd once aspired to, but it's certainly solid for my current needs. The transition has been challenging. Readjusting to being someone else's employee rather than being fully in charge takes some serious adaptation, but it's also surprisingly uplifting. I'm realizing how rewarding it can be to focus on my specific role and excel in it without carrying the entire weight of a company on my shoulders. Regarding the old family business, it's a sad situation all around. Many of you have asked what my brother's been up to lately, and I regret to say there's not much of a story there, at least nothing uplifting. He sold off what little remained of the firm and is strapped for cash. He was forced to give up the flashy cars and the stylish townhouse he flaunted. I have no idea where he's staying now because we're no longer in contact. As for my mother, I'm not close to her at this moment. I'm aware my father left enough money for her to live comfortably, and if she ever genuinely required my help, I would of course step up. My issue remains squarely with my brother, not her. It's genuinely unfortunate that an enterprise with such a rich heritage has disintegrated so completely, but I've moved beyond it. I'm genuinely enthusiastic about what's on the horizon for me. Thanks again for all your support, it truly has meant a great deal. Update 3. Greetings again, everyone. Time has flown by, and I just want to spread some positive news. I'm currently developing my own startup, something I've been dreaming about. I spent nearly a year in my new job, carefully pooling the resources I needed to make this leap. Now, I have a tight-knit, devoted team, and we're making progress on some exciting ventures. It's exhausting but unbelievably fulfilling to see how my vision is slowly taking shape. As for that old family business, it's officially a distant memory now, completely gone. It's tragic to witness the downfall of something that had been in my family for decades, yet I'm choosing to focus on the valuable lessons gleaned from that experience. I'm looking ahead, brimming with optimism for a brighter tomorrow. Thank you all for sticking by me on this roller coaster. Now, let's transition into the next part of my story. Story 2. My fiancée cheated with my brother, and later I discovered she was pregnant, so I made them deeply regret what they'd done. I, at 28 years old, believed I was living out the perfect romantic fairy tale. I was engaged to a woman named Selena, who had once been my college sweetheart, someone whose warm and sociable nature enchanted me from the moment our eyes met. My heart felt an instantaneous bond the minute we crossed paths, and every day with her felt like living in a world of wonder. But, as reality often intrudes, fairy tales can take cruel twists. Ours was no exception, and I eventually woke up from that wonderful dream only to confront a painful betrayal. We had a long-distance relationship for a considerable stretch. After a few years of dating during college, dealing with our cultural differences and physical distance became such a burden that, at the 2-year mark, we conceded defeat and separated. We both walked our own paths. But somehow, fate had different intentions for us. My younger brother, whom I'll call John, is the epitome of an outgoing, party-loving individual. He was constantly visiting nightclubs, hosting wild gatherings, and living a lifestyle diametrically opposed to mine. Because he was the youngest in the family, my parents gave him a very lenient upbringing, never truly disciplining him for his bad behavior or questionable decisions. Though I held love for my brother, our relationship was perpetually strained. My parents regularly cast aside my needs to cater to his. After completing my studies to become a German translator, I seldom spent time with my parents or John, except for the occasional family celebration. It wasn't that I harbored no fondness for them at all, but the pattern of them prioritizing John's whims had created a rift in my feelings. John would sometimes show up at my place inebriated and looking for a couch to crash on, and I generally let him. He was quite the piece of work, no real job, just burning through my parents' money. But this is where our paths crossed again with Selena. My father, growing exhausted with John's pointless lifestyle, gave him an ultimatum and forced him to take on real employment, which led John to become a bartender at a prestigious nightclub. One evening, John invited me to a grand party he was throwing there. It was crowded, the music was thunderous, and the energy was off the charts. In the midst of all that chaos, I was happily surprised to bump into several old college acquaintances, and then I saw her, Selena, seated confidently, chatting with John, who was blatantly flirting with her in his usual provocative manner. It almost made me laugh, seeing him try his moves on her. My heart skipped a beat when she noticed me, and suddenly I remembered that the love I felt for her had never really disappeared. All those feelings came rushing to the surface as if no time had passed. I nervously gestured for her to come over, and she did, folding me into a warm hug. We spoke for a while, and I was exhilarated to catch up on where life had led each of us. John was startled to learn we already knew each other. Eventually, I headed out, but Selena and I exchanged numbers. The more time I spent thinking about her gentle but lively demeanor, the more I hoped she might still harbor romantic feelings for me. Neither of us had gone on to have serious relationships after college, and we were both residing in the same city now. The possibility of reviving what we once had made my heart flutter. I noted that she and John seemed chummy, but it felt awkward to pry into when they had first met, so I let it slide. We began reaching out to each other more frequently, sometimes for hours on end, bridging the gap that time had created between us. Within a few months, I decided to officially invite her to a family dinner at my parents' home, intending to propose marriage to her that very evening. Because our hearts were still close, and the concept of just dating again seemed insufficient for how strongly I felt. After dinner, I guided her to my old bedroom, showing her nostalgic bits of my childhood, old photos, silly knickknacks, random memorabilia. We laughed and reminisced, with me feeling a surge of hope and excitement building up. Finally, I took a steadying breath, handed her a small journal filled with heartfelt notes I had written just for us, and nestled inside was a ring along with a small card asking for her hand in marriage. She wept joyfully, then wrapped her arms around me and enthusiastically said yes. It was an incredibly poignant moment, one that made me believe all the trials we had undergone were worth it. My parents were already fond of Selena from when we'd been together before. However, I couldn't help being a bit worried about how her family might react, given cultural norms, but she pledged to fight for us, saying it was her life and her choice. The plan was to throw an official engagement gathering once we got her parents' formal approval. Afterward, we settled on the living room couch, enjoying ice cream, chatting about everything we envisioned for our future. John was glued to his phone, and I noticed Selena kept casting quick glances his way, almost as if she were trying to coax him into participating. At one point, she got ice cream on her lips, and I reached over to wipe it for her, but John beat me to it, wiping it off and eyeing her in a way that made me squirm inside. I'm generally pretty even-tempered, but that moment sparked a flicker of unease. They both burst into laughter, and she apologized, stating they were simply great friends, that I shouldn't read too much into it. John also made a remark about how I knew exactly how best friends behaved. I forced a laugh, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort. I bluntly asked them where they had actually first met, which wiped the grins right off their faces. They exchanged nervous looks. Then Selena concocted some fabricated tale about a time John was in an accident back in December, but I was fully aware he had been abroad that month. He tried to patch over the lie, but I stopped him and made it clear that lying was not acceptable. Eventually, he changed his story, saying they had met at a gathering where John was ill from too much alcohol and Selena had rescued him. I let it go, but my doubts started swirling. Within a week, both of us visited Selena's parents to seek their permission for our union. Admittedly, it was not simple. Her father was stern and needed reassurance, so it took multiple conversations, but her mother helped us win him over. Though formal, he seemed like the sort of person who genuinely wanted the best for his daughter. Meanwhile, Selena and John kept on being extremely close, which I continually reminded myself could be a positive thing, especially if they shared hobbies or a sense of humor. Strangely, John was becoming more attentive and mindful overall, asking me for advice and acting like he valued my input. Selena would also approach me for tips on how to handle John's newly found desire for maturity. They were almost the same age, so I figured it was just a strong friendship. Still, I'd get the occasional twinge of doubt. Update 1. About a month passed, and my nerves were on edge. Selena and John's behavior seemed borderline flirtatious, and I was having trouble sleeping. I confronted Selena about my insecurities one evening, right before our engagement. We ended up in a rather intense argument, which ironically led to her trying to soothe me. She insisted there was absolutely nothing romantic between her and my brother, telling me that if she were going to be disloyal, she would have done it outright. She also pointed out that I had a habit of overthinking, which was likely just fueling my anxiety. She reassured me that if her closeness with John caused me such distress, she'd be mindful of how she interacted with him and set clearer boundaries. I couldn't help but recall a moment at a beach party we had thrown at my parents' vacation house. She looked stunning in a bikini, exuding confidence among her friends and cousins. I had stepped away to make sure the party lights were set up for the evening, and upon returning, I nearly exploded with anger. I found Selena practically giving John a lap dance, not exactly an erotic performance, but enough to leave me furious. He had his hands in very inappropriate places, and my protective instincts shot up. I yelled at them, and a hush fell over the gathering. They both insisted it was part of a silly dare, that I was misinterpreting everything. I forcefully escorted Selena to a private room, venting all my pent-up emotions. She seemed genuinely terrified and promised me there was absolutely no deeper meaning behind what I'd witnessed. Eventually, John apologized, admitting it was all in jest and that he was out of control. In the aftermath, my mother gave him a stern scolding. Though I was still unsettled, I tried to accept their apologies, hoping my lingering suspicions would vanish. At last, the engagement day arrived, and it was a spectacular ceremony. We chose to have a small event at a chapel, where we wrote personal vows to each other. She was radiant, dressed in an outfit that made her look like a living dream. The entire atmosphere was emotional and heartfelt, making me feel like everything was finally aligning. We danced, laughed, and had a wonderful time. If I had been told years ago that this moment was coming, I'd have called it impossible. My brother was predictably getting hammered with drinks, dancing around without a care, while Selena abstained from alcohol entirely, and so did I, out of solidarity. Once the celebration concluded, Selena and I shared a few minutes of quiet reflection. She peppered my face with gentle kisses, and it was so endearing that I practically melted. We eventually ended up at my apartment, where the passion was palpable. However, she held back from fully consummating things, saying she wanted to wait until the wedding. I admired her decision, and we simply basked in each other's presence. A few days later, after work, I spontaneously decided to drop by Selena's place for a surprise visit, thinking it would be nice to take her out to dinner. But just as I parked, I noticed my brother's car. The sight sent a chill of dread through me. I approached her door, knocked multiple times, but nobody answered. My heart was racing. I retreated to my vehicle, intending to calm myself, but then I saw John emerge from her house. My mind started spinning with ugly possibilities, especially given all the red flags I'd seen over the past few months. Selena later called me, greeting me warmly, so I mustered the nerve to go inside, handing her flowers. She welcomed me with a tender hug and a flurry of kisses, which confused me all the more. I sat on the sofa, my thoughts jumbled. Finally, I asked her about John's visit. She brushed it off, saying he was unwell and came to get some medication. That explanation felt strangely casual, but I held my tongue. For the rest of the evening, I was lost in my own thoughts, suspicious about everything. Selena didn't give any sign that she was hiding something, yet my gut was screaming otherwise. Her phone was often face down, and she seemed to never use her internet in front of me. We'd once planned to have a destination wedding soon, but she told me she needed to delay, hoping to get promoted at the hospital where she worked. Her phone replies to me became slower, and she seemed irritated more often than not. So, I tried to be patient, giving her the space she might need. Update 2. 2 months crawled by, and I have to say everything I feared was painfully validated. My anxieties might have appeared exaggerated at first, but sometimes your instincts aren't lying to you. The life I considered my fairy tale was disintegrating right in front of me. My mental well-being took a drastic hit, and I ended up seeking therapy. Selena had grown increasingly distant, her lukewarm texts, endless excuses, and constant unavailability left me distraught. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided on a weekend to pay her another visit unannounced. I armed myself with her favorite macarons and a bouquet of fresh flowers. Arriving at her place, I knocked repeatedly, but was met with silence. That's when I noticed John's car again, hidden to the side. My stomach tightened in dread, a swirl of raw panic overcame me, and I didn't know whether to confront them both directly or just vanish. After a few minutes, John finally exited, and my worst suspicions were confirmed. After he drove away, Selena contacted me, acting as though everything was normal. She readily invited me in. Holding back my emotions, I entered with the treats and tried to compose myself. She clung to me in an affectionate greeting, pressing kisses to my face for what felt like ages. Part of me longed to believe she was still that compassionate, God-fearing person I had known. Then, I stepped into the bathroom, intending only to rinse my hands. That's where I found it, a positive pregnancy test lying near the trash bin, as though it had been tossed there in a hurry and missed its mark. My hands were trembling, and my heart pounded so hard I could scarcely hear my own thoughts. Selena, realizing I'd discovered something, started knocking fervently, likely aware that her secret was out. My mind went blank. Stunned, I slowly unlocked the door, holding up the test. She dropped to her knees, begging me to give her a chance to explain. But all I felt was the devastation of her betrayal. She had thoroughly broken me. If it were John, I would have expected no less, but I never believed she would stoop so low as to mislead me to this extent. Speechless, I walked out, ignoring the tears streaming down her face. I headed to my parents' home, deeply shaken, needing someone to confide in, though I wasn't sure if they would side with me. John was seated there. His expression had zero regret. I exploded, directing my fury at all of them, blaming my parents for enabling John. Over the years, their permissive attitude had turned him into an unscrupulous manipulator, someone who would not think twice before betraying his own brother. My mother and father tried to apologize, but it was far too late. Selena arrived, crying so hard she could hardly speak, hugging me repeatedly. She had snuffed out my joy, turning the beautiful dream I had into a wretched mess. Everything was now out in the open. I invited Selena's parents to come over so we could address this disaster together. When they arrived, I placed the pregnancy test on the table. Selena's mother was shocked and furious, even slapping her in frustration, demanding to know where she had gone wrong in her upbringing. My own heartbreak was excruciating. I declared the engagement null and void. She was pregnant with my brother's child, so there was no turning back. It was a level of double-crossing I never could have imagined. My parents decided that John would marry her, hoping to salvage some vestige of moral responsibility out of this debacle. Update 3. Inevitably, Selena faced one crushing blow after another. The biggest surprise was that John felt cornered by the thought of fatherhood and marital commitment. Despite how intensely Selena had chased him, using me as a ploy to make him jealous, the second she was actually pregnant and he was being told to step up as a husband, he freaked out. He began pushing her to end the pregnancy. Her mother, grounded in her spiritual beliefs, refused to let her terminate. Seemingly out of nowhere, Selena came to understand how she had dug her own grave. She saw that John was never going to be faithful, realizing she had allowed her obsession to destroy my life, only to end up tormented herself by his shifting affections. In contrast, I received medication for my anxiety and depression and started attending therapy sessions. Feeling severed from any real family bond, I decided to accept a job abroad. John never once admitted fault or came to me with an apology, and honestly, that was exactly the kind of heartless conduct I expected from him. My parents felt guilty but were powerless to reverse the damage. I still pitied Selena to a certain degree, even though she had toyed with me, because she ended up on the receiving end of the same manipulation. John displayed no signs of ever being a father or stable partner. Eventually, Selena opted to be a single mother, with my family committing to assist financially to some extent, offering her a small house. Even then, John resumed his irresponsible life without remorse. Meanwhile, I packed my bags and flew away, looking for a clean slate. The emotional anguish doesn't magically dissolve, but time and therapy have helped. I trust my instincts and wholeheartedly believe that certain lessons, no matter how excruciating, forge us into stronger individuals. Selena painfully realized her mistake, but her realization came far too late. As for John, he remains stuck in his destructive cycle. And I've made my peace with it, holding on to the hope of a future where genuine trust and kindness still exist.